Throughout the history of paleontology, there have been few debates as long-running and potentially heated as those involving the tyrant lizard king. Amongst this discourse, one debate stood above many in a class all its own. In the final days of the Mesozoic, did Tyrannosaurus reign over its North American domain alone as the last and greatest of the tyrannosaurs, or did another enigmatic heir to the tyrant reptile legacy stand short in its own way? Nanotyrannus was a name that once invited chaos and sparked division at the mere mention of it for decades, but it might now go down in history in a whole different way. So, how did we get to this point? A point at which, right before Halloween 2025, a seemingly long-buried genus of dinosaur came clawing its way out of its taxonomic grave. I know I've said countless times in my other videos that I don't really ever want to touch the Rex v Nano debate, but now is the perfect time to, considering what has been discovered. Due to the weirdness of Jane, a conference was held at the Burpee Museum of Illinois in 2005. However, it wasn't all to do with Jane, Nanotyrannus, or the Rex v Nano debate. As J. Michael Parrish and Ralph Molnar write up in a 2013 compilation of many of the talks given at the 2005 conference, quote, "Of the 30 presentations given, 8 concentrated on Tyrannosaur ontogeny, 21 on other aspects of Tyrannosaur paleobiology, and 1 each about dating, Jane, and about Barnum Brown." End quote. The vibe coming out of this conference was that Jane was a juvenile Tyrannosaurus, and that this likely meant that Nanotyrannus was no longer a valid genus. Some preliminary work on the internal anatomy of Jane's bone structure, plus the fact that it sports some lack of fusion in the bones, and general immature traits seen in known juvenile specimens of Tarbosaurus, all proved early on that the Jane specimen was indeed a juvenile animal. Comparing the size and age-related traits of Jane to estimates of Tyrannosaurus growth rates also seemed to indicate that Jane was at the right size and age to have died shortly before reaching a massive growth spurt. This was taken as further proof that Jane was a juvenile Tyrannosaurus, as it would have needed to take on this growth spurt to start to change into something more like an adult Tyrannosaurus. That said, a paper by Pete Larson in the 2013 Tyrannosaurid Paleobiology book that resulted from the 2005 Burpee Conference found that certain parts of Jane's skeleton actually had fused. For example, Larson found the scapulocoracoid or shoulder girdle, pelvis, and the center and dorsal spines of the vertebrae throughout the spine had all fused or almost fused. Larson also brought up the tooth count issue, with Jane and the Cleveland skull sporting 15 or 16 tooth positions in the upper jaw, with all known adult Tyrannosaur specimens containing 11 or 12 positions. The same issue is reflected in the lower jaw or dentary bones. Jane and Cleveland have 17 tooth positions, and Tyrannosauruses all have 13 or 14. Another weird thing is that the teeth in the very tip of the jaw, a bone called the premaxilla, aren't serrated, but those same teeth are serrated in Tyrannosaurus. The bigger issue in the early 2000s really just was that there were only 2 purported specimens of Nanotyrannus, and they're both not fully mature. In order to get a good handle on all this, one way or another, you'd need a lot more and of different ages and sizes to better smooth out the gaps. A definitively adult Nanotyrannus, or a juvenile Tyrannosaurus that clearly wasn't a nano, would have settled the debate pretty definitively. While several specimens were proposed to be juvenile Tyrannosaurus, there was a lot of ambiguity as to their identity, and some argued that they were nanospecimens or separate genera or species in their own right. LACM 23845 Dinotyrannus Megagracilis. All the way back in 1967, while paleontologist Harley Garbani was uncovering the skull and fragmentary postcranial remains of an adult Tyrannosaurus from the Hell Creek Formation at the L.D. Engdahl Ranch in Garfield County, Montana, and that would go on to have the specimen number LACM 23844 and nickname Harley, his team from the LA County Museum found another Tyrannosaur in the scrap piles made by a bulldozer moving overburden away. This rather fragmentary second specimen would turn out to be relatively immature, as it was quite a bit smaller than most adult tyrannosaurs, either at the time of discovery or even as far forward as 2001 and 2005 with the Jane Conference. The second Tyrannosaur, LACM 23845, consists of a skull that includes the right maxilla, right lacrimal, the frontals, nasals, parietals, dentaries, right coronoid, and right syringular bones. The rest of it subsists of the right scapula and coracoid, or shoulder girdle, the right ulna, both ischia of the pelvis, the right femur, tibia, and astragalus, a nearly complete right foot, and 2 phalanges from the left foot. Not bad, but also not amazing. This thing was always considered an immature tyrannosaur. It was just always unclear how specifically one could identify it. In 1980, Ralph Molnar referred the specimen to Albertosaurus lancensis, a temporary name given to Gorgosaurus lancensis since Gorgosaurus and Albertosaurus had been lumped together for a time. Then the enigmatic artist and sometimes researcher Greg Paul published on the specimen in 1988, renaming the species label to Albertosaurus megagracilis. George Olszewski then did some more work on this thing in 1995, upgrading the genus label to a new one, Dinotyrannus megagracilis. This analysis found LACM 23845 closely related to Nanotyrannus. In 2000, Oliver Rauhat did some more investigation of all this stuff and found that technically, the species identification was kinda mediocre. Greg Paul hadn't illustrated the specimen, provided incorrect references, and gave no actual formal list of diagnosis for this species. So, sadly, Megagracilis would fall under the nomen nudum label, a naked name. Eventually, the specimen would be subsumed into the Tyrannosaurus rex species, just like Nanotyrannus. However, it represents something different still, as it is larger than the Cleveland skull and Jane. Despite this, it wouldn't play much of a role in any future discussions on Nanotyrannus validity. It would be placed in some growth rate graphs since it was lumped into T.rex, so it stood in the place of the growth changes between Jane and smaller adult specimens. That 2005 Burpee Conference seemed to tentatively validate the idea that Nanotyrannus was a juvenile Tyrannosaurus. Some nanotruthers, like Phil Curry and Michael Williams, were convinced due to the work of Carr and others, plus the lack of other specimens and the more or less definitive immaturity of the two known specimens. Sure, Larson would find a whole list of reasons as to why Jane wasn't really young enough to fit the growth curve for Tyrannosaurus, but many other justifications against this would sort of drown it out in greater discussions. Growth rate studies would use the Cleveland skull, Jane, and LACM 23845 to great effect, finding that Tyrannosaurs had moderate growth for the first couple years of life before getting as large as Jane, slowing down a little bit, before hitting a huge growth spurt into the LACM 23845 size and then the adult size we all know and love. Still, detractors were not fully convinced, and some researchers, like Nicholas Longrich and Thomas Holtz, remained open to the possibility that Nanotyrannus was valid even if there wasn't really any definitive word on it. The consensus increasingly favored the hypothesis that Nanotyrannus was indeed just a synonym for underdeveloped, long-legged teen rexes before they hit their major growth spurt. This led to numerous studies using these juvenile nanospecimens as juvenile Tyrannosaurus when trying to understand growth rate, skull remodeling, paleobiology, and paleoecology. It also led to speculations that the various ecosystems present in geologic formations such as the Lance and Hell Creek operated very differently than modern ecosystems. Juvenile rexes were mesopredators. In most modern ecosystems, there is a size gradient in both herbivores and carnivores. If one were to look at Yellowstone National Park, for instance, one would find herbivores of all size classes, from rodents to bison to moose. There is a smooth gradient in body size with many different animals filling in the spots from micro to small to adequate to medium large to giant. The same goes for carnivores, with shrews to weasels to foxes, bobcats, coyotes, wolves, cougars, and bears. Even with the missing Ice Age megafauna, there is still an equal body size gradient in both animal guilds, and many of the species in each size class occupy a range of niches that often overlap. The ecosystems in the Hell Creek and Lance formations seem to be kinda messed up. The herbivores were the less messed up, as they seemed to obey the same size gradient as the Yellowstone exemplar. You've got small pachycephalosaurs, like Spheratholus, a little smaller than a coyote. This increases to Leptoceratops, to Thessalosaurus, Pachycephalosaurus, Denversaurus, Ankylosaurus, Triceratops and Torosaurus, and finally with Edmontosaurus as the largest known herbivore. The weird part is that the carnivore guilds for these formations did not work this way and did not match the Yellowstone exemplar, and for further context, the Yellowstone thing is seen in many other ecosystems globally. Instead, Hell Creek and Lance showed a distinct lack of mesopredators, or carnivores occupying the size niche between small critters and big guys. Gyaracuncus is the smallest, and an insectivore. You have the dromaeosaurs, Achiroraptor, and Pectinodon, and that's pretty much it. There were oviraptorosaurs, such as Anzu and Eoneophron, plus the ornithomimosaurs, Ornithomimus, and Struthiomimus. However, these four theropod dinosaurs are sort of ecologically ambiguous. They may be omnivorous, but exactly how carnivorous or herbivorous they were remains a subject of debate. I think they can count since their claws and jaws look adapted for snagging and chomping on small prey items, but regardless, they don't really count as pure carnivores nor as pure predators. The only thing that does, or did, is Dakotaraptor, which was between Deinonychus and Utahraptor in size, assuming it's valid. Dakotaraptor has way more issues with it than even Nanotyrannus, so for all intents and purposes, it doesn't count. Not yet anyways. Plus, some of these critters are extremely new, so the lack of mesopredators was an even bigger issue in the 2000s and early 2010s, when this was used in the Rex v Nano debate. Now, this issue can also be seen in other Mesozoic geologic formations. One possible answer as to why this happens is preservational bias. In other words, the fossil record has a hard time preserving everything. Big, heavy bones can survive longer before becoming buried and turned to mineral through fossilization. Smaller things are more fragile and are more easily torn apart. The other issue is sampling bias, aka not enough people are out there in enough places searching for fossils. Some geologic formations get more attention and resources than others. The Hell Creek Formation is one of these overly advantaged layers, due to slipping a Tyrannosaurus out every now and then. So it would make sense that, let's say, the Cloverleaf Formation of early Cretaceous Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah would have those ecological size gaps in known fossil animals. The Hell Creek, in comparison, has 10 or more times the attention and still has this weird gap. I don't know, sort of makes one think there is more of a preservational bias going on than solely a sampling bias, right? Alright, so how does this get solved with Hell Creek? One hypothesis that became the consensus for many years, from the 2000s to the 2010s, was that both Hell Creek and Tyrannosaurus were extremely bizarre. The reasoning is that ecosystems of the past might just have been entirely different, or at least super unique compared to those with us today. Why were there no mesopredators in the most heavily worked geologic formation on Earth? Tyrannosaurus was the mesopredator. The Nanotyrannus specimens, now understood to be Juvenile Tyrannosaurus, would occupy the ecological size niche of the mesopredator, having muscled out any native competition there may have been when the Tyrannosaurus genus or its ancestors migrated into North America from Asia. Though that funny jaw from New Mexico might mean these big beasties had been around the whole time, left to Asia only to come back to North America. A toxic relationship if I've ever seen one. This was first proposed by Thomas Holtz in a 2008 paper in the compendium Tyrannosaurus the Tyrant King, which was the first of 2 books to come out of the 2005 Burpee Nanotyrannus Conference. He noted the possibility that juvenile Tyrannosaurus occupied a different ecological niche to the adults due to the dramatic difference in skeletal anatomy. This was carried forward in a 2010 science paper by Steve Brusatte and crew, eventually getting a new term, Ontogenetic niche partitioning. Well, alright, problem solved, right? That seems to make more sense, right? These juvenile Tyrannosaurs had skinnier blade-like teeth and longer legs for going after smaller prey, and then morphed into the giant adult Tyrannosaurus with bone-pulverizing teeth for use against the really big prey animals. Many papers even put up the modern American alligator as an example of this sort of ontogenetic niche partitioning, not only occurring in nature, but in the Archosaur group too. Well, as it would turn out, this actually makes less sense the longer you think about it. No modern ecosystem and their animal guilds work this way. Even with our modern ecologically impoverished ecosystems, there is still so much diversity and overlap in ecological niche that no juvenile acts as its own unique species in the ecosystem. I can see where experts were coming from though. Dinosaurs were super weird compared to mammals, even though you can cherry pick some as possibly having mammalian growth curves or physiologies. The alligator example is sort of in a gray area because it is true that their young occupy a different spot in the ecosystem, but they don't muzzle out adult forms of species that are the same size as them. In fact, they are prey for animals even only slightly larger than themselves. The little gatorlings have a weak as heck bite compared to their mammas and pappas. A catfish only 5 inches longer than a baby gator will try to swallow it. The baby gators also only eat things that can fit in their mouths and down their throats. They cannot and do not attack and kill prey as large or larger than themselves, as their death roll is not as deathy or rolly as an adult. They go after tadpoles, small fish, big bugs, rodents, and that sort of stuff. So, though their diet definitely shifts as they age, and though they definitely fit into a different ecological slot as they age, they do not act as a separate species as a baby. So this could very well apply to juvenile Tyrannosaurus, whatever they end up looking like. However, since Tyrannosaurus is a predator and would be far rarer in the ecosystem than herbivores, once a juvenile ages up into an adult, there would be a void in the ecosystem that would otherwise be hypothetically filled by medium-sized mesopredators. In other words, though there is truth to the idea that a juvenile Tyrannosaurus would occupy a different ecological niche to its parent, assuming it did not live with and hunt with its parents for a very long period of time, there would still need to be mesopredators to fill in the same role in the ecosystem as these juvenile Tyrannosauruses aged out of this ecological niche and took on the roles of other adults. It's simply not a good argument for the synonymy of Nanotyrannus and Tyrannosaurus. That said, maybe I'm making it out to be a bigger talking point than it ever truly was. It was certainly something many experts talked about, and it did get its own special hypothesis name, ontogenetic niche partitioning, but it was only one of many talking points regarding the Nano-v-Rex debate.
Then, everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked.
Takanobu Tsuihiji and a group of other dinosaur experts published a paper in the journal Vertebrate Paleontology in 2011. Covering the growth changes seen in the Asian tyrannosaur Tarbosaurus. This paper provided both pros and cons to the Nano-v-Rex debate. The paper described the skeleton of a juvenile tyrannosaur that had then been discovered in Mongolia in 2006. They found that the specimen had all the hallmarks of a juvenile Tarbosaurus and was from the right time and place. The specimen was, and may technically still be, one of the ontogenetically youngest tyrannosaurs known from the most complete remains. The study found that the diet of juvenile tyrannosaurs may have shifted as the animals aged, since the skull was not as strong and the body proportions meant they were faster and nimbler than their adults. However, they also found that tooth count did not change from juvenile to adult, but were only different between individuals, meaning that any major tooth difference would indicate a difference in species, or some wacky genetic thing going on amongst individuals of a species. This is a major stick in the Nanotyrannus debate's craw, as it will keep coming up as one of the major points of contention. However, before it becomes super relevant, there is yet another paper and anatomical piece of information we need to consider. Larson 2013. Pete Larson, Tyrannosaur expert and dirty capitalist, published a paper in the Tyrannosaur Paleobiology book in 2013, the book that was a result of the 2005 Burpee Conference on Jane, but almost a decade late to print. He then presented on this very paper as a poster at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology Conference. In both, he argues for the validity of Nanotyrannus. He notes that the fusion of many of the bones throughout the spinal column, shoulders, and pelvis indicate that Jane was near adulthood when it died, contrary to the unfused nature of some of its other bones. He also argues that all known relevant Nanotyrannus specimens have more teeth in their upper and lower jaws, that those teeth are different in anatomy, that there is a unique exit hole for the major nerve that runs through the upper jaw, unique holes in the skull through which air sacs would have passed, a shallowness to the large indentation present in the upper jawbone called an antorbital fossa, this long groove going along the jaw here, a wishbone that looks different to the one in Tyrannosaurus, an outward-facing shoulder socket. As he states, quote, a proportionally and absolutely larger manus, end quote, or hand. A hand that has actual finger bones in the third finger, even though this third finger is still reduced and nearly vestigial. And finally, a hooked form of part of the pelvis that points forward. That seems like a lot. Do you think he stopped to breathe while writing all that? You know, I just stopped to breathe more than a few times, but I edited those out because I hate the way they sound in my little earbuds. Editing ASMR might kill me. The reason some of these Nanotyrannus specimens seem to fit the mold, as it were, of the growth series of Tyrannosaurs and Tyrannosaurus itself, as Pete argues and cites John Horam as arguing as far back as 2005, is that contentious specimens were used as juvenile Tyrannosaurs in the growth chart data. Compared to other Tyrannosaurs like Tarbosaurus, some things seemed strange with Tyrannosaurus growth. The only way forward would be if new specimens were described, and just such a breakthrough was finally made in 2025, but there's a good bit of tyrannical lore between 2011 and 2025 that I think bears mentioning. For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, like this video, drop a comment in the comment section below, and hit the bell icon to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching.